So we made it to chapter 27, which is our last chapter in unit 1 of Bio 2. This is the animal chapter. So we're going to talk about some characteristics that are used to describe animals, what makes an animal, and vertebrate and invertebrate animal diversity. So what makes an animal an animal? So animals are all eukaryotic and multicellular. They're in the supergroup Uniconta and the clade Opistheconta. Their cells exist in an extracellular matrix, and some of them have specialized tissue or specialized sensory structures like a nervous system or muscles for movement. They've got unique cell junctions. If you remember from Bio 1, those gap junctions, tight junctions, and anchoring junctions. And then animals are heterotrophs. They generally ingest their food and digest it internally. Animals do not have cell walls, and they typically do sexual reproduction. So these are the different animal phyla we're going to go over. I crossed out all of the ones we're not going to talk about. So this would be a good slide for you to review to make sure you know the different animal groups that we're going to go over. And we're going to go over each of these kind of individually, but it's kind of a good place to show you where we're going. Traditionally, when we classified animals, it was based on morphological and developmental features. We would look at the presence or absence of different tissue types, their body symmetry, features of their embryonic development, and other sort of things that we could actually see unassisted or maybe with a microscope. Modern animal classification is based more on molecular techniques. So we look at similarities in DNA, similarities in ribosomal RNA, and in particular, the small ribosomal subunit has been important for kind of classifying organisms and sort of teasing apart the branches of that tree of life. And so hopefully you remember tissues from Bio 1, right? A tissue is a group of similar cells working together, so sort of cells that function as a unit. So most animals have tissue. However, the sponges, which fall in the phylum Porifera, and they're in the parazoa. Para means beside, zoa, animals. So these are animals technically, but unlike other animals, sponges do not have specialized tissues or organs. Eumetazoa, that root word eu means true, so the quote true animals have more than one tissue type. So with tissues they can make organs, right? Because tissues work together in organs and then organ systems and so on and so forth there. Broadly speaking, animal tissues include connective tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. But we'll talk more about that in our animal form and function units. With symmetry, different kinds of animals have different symmetry or different body plans. So everybody besides the sponges either has radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry. Radial animals have this kind of circular symmetry, right? Where they can be cut across any plane here, and they're sort of the same on both sides. They have oral and arboreal sides, and they are diploblastic. That root word di means two, so they have two germ layers. They have an endoderm for their inner layer of tissue and an ectoderm for their outer layer of tissue. Bilaterally symmetrical animals have sort of left and right halves, broadly speaking, and they have cephalization, which is the fancy way to say they have a head because they have their special sense organs, so organs for vision and smell and taste, right, on the anterior end of their body or the front end of their body. They also have dorsal, which is back, and ventral, which is belly sides, and they have anterior, which is front, and posterior, which is back sides. And these guys are triploblastic, so they have that endoderm inner layer, that ectoderm outer germ layer, and then they have a mesoderm. Meso is middle, so that mesoderm is between the endoderm and ectoderm. So let's review. Match the animal to the type of symmetry. If it has asymmetry, bilateral symmetry, or radial symmetry, and determine if the animal falls into eumetazoa or parazoa. So this first animal is a sponge. The sponge is asymmetrical, and it is parazoa. The next one is related to the jellyfish. So it has that radial symmetry and it is a eumetazoan. And then our last one, what kind of symmetry is this? It has, that was a terrible dividing line that I drew, but it has relatively similar left and right halves, so that's bilateral symmetry, and it is also in eumetazoa. So that brings us to protostomes and deuterostomes. So in embryonic development, basically the super short story on embryonic development, right? You have a sperm and egg, they fuse, you get a diploid zygote. That zygote divides into a ball of cells. That hollow ball of cells gets its first embryonic opening, which is called the blastopore. So we can divide animals into groups based on what that blastopore becomes. So in protostomes, that blastopore becomes the mouth. The mouth develops from the blastopore. And in deuterostomes, that blastopore develops into the anus. There's also some difference in how these cells divide. And quite honestly, this feature seems to have been more important when we were talking with morphological characterization of the animals. Now this is sort of less well talked about. And then this is super cheesy and juvenile, and I'm almost hesitant to put it on the recording, but one way you can determine the difference between protostomes and deuterostomes, or help remember the difference between protostomes and deuterostomes, is I think like doo-doo, and then I think anus. So there's my cheesy memory trick for that. Another characteristic that is used to describe the differences morphologically between different groups of animals is descriptions about their body cavity or coelom. Previously, this was really important for constructing phylogeny, but it's now thought to be a little bit unreliable because, you know, this may have arisen more than once or may have been present in an organism but lost over time. But broadly speaking, we can talk about these body cavities by saying an organism is acoelomate. Broadly, we can talk about these body cavities by saying an organism is acoelomate. That root word a means without, so they do not have a body cavity between the intestinal canal and the body wall. Their body is packed solid with mesoderm. That root word pseudo means like false or fake. So pseudocoelomates, they have a body cavity that's incompletely aligned with mesoderm, but it is not completely. So it is a pseudocoelom. That root word eu still means true, so eucoelomates have a body cavity that is completely lined with mesoderm. They have a mesentery membrane that supports internal organs. Their body movements are more free because that outer body wall can move independently of the organs, so there's not as much friction, and the organs have more space to become more complex. Broadly, we can talk about these body cavities, but an organism is acoelomate. That root word a means without, so they do not have a body cavity between the intestinal body wall. Their body is packed solid with mesoderm. That root word pseudo means like false or fake. So pseudocoelomates, they have a body cavity that's incompletely aligned with mesoderm, but it is not completely. So it is a pseudocoelom. That root word eu still means true, so eucoelomates have a body cavity that is completely lined with mesoderm. They have a mesentery membrane that supports internal organs. Their body movements are more free because that outer body wall can move independently of the organs, so there's not as much friction, and the organs have more space to become more complex. So let's review. In this image, which series of images represents deuterostomes? So again, with deuterostomes, we are looking for that first embryonic opening, the blastopore developing into the anus. So this second picture, the blastopore develops into the anus, so that is deuterostomes. And then we have label coelomate, and acoelomate organism. So it might be easiest to find the acoelomate first. That's going to be one where the organism is packed completely full with mesoderm. So that is our last option here, the acoelomate, right? So it does have a digestive tract, but this body is packed completely full with mesoderm tissue. Then we've got to find the pseudocoelomate and the eucoelomate or coelomate organism. So let's see. Our first picture, we've got this digestive tract, and then this digestive tract is completely lined here. I'm using red so it's hard to see. So there's this fluid-filled body cavity and this complete lining around it. So that's going to be our eucoelomate, right? And then here we have our digestive tract. There's a fluid area here and then just one lining. It's not completely lined. So that's our pseudocoelomate there. You might also notice I did not do a great job with editing the picture to hide the answer from you, right? So if you look at the fine print, the first one says it has a coelom, the second one says it has a pseudocoelom. So I suppose it's worth looking when you're, good test taking strategy, use the information in the pictures if it tells you information in the pictures. So other terms that we can use to talk about differences in animals would be, we would talk about their skeletons. So a hydrostatic skeleton, hydro is talking about water. So these are fluid-based skeletons. They are found in soft-bodied animals. Many animals have hydrostatic skeletons. So jellyfish, earthworms, there's actually multiple groups of worms, and they would all have hydrostatic skeletons. Exoskeletons, exo is outside of, so these are skeletons that have external support on them. So insects, spiders, they have exoskeleton. Clams, mussels, they have exoskeletons. And then we have an endoskeleton. We have an internal skeleton we have bone. There's other endoskeletons that are made of cartilage. Some animals are segmented, meaning they're made of repeating units. It may be easy to see in like a segmented worm. It's made up of all of these repeating units, or it may be easy to see in something like an insect, with its repeating units of legs. But even vertebrates like ourselves, we're made up of repeating units of vertebrae as well. So let's label the kind of skeleton found in the organism. So our first one has an exoskeleton. It has that hard, crunchy exterior. Our bird is a vertebrate, so it has an endoskeleton. And then our jellyfish over here has a hydrostatic skeleton. I'm abbreviating because it's very hard to write with the pen. These are not standard abbreviations, right? And then put an S by organisms that are segmented. So our first guy here, made up of multiple repeating units, so that's segmented. Our bird is a vertebrate, so that's segmented. And then I know that you want to say, oh, that jellyfish is made of repeating units, but generally speaking, people do not talk about jellyfish being segmented. So that's a little tricky, and I would not do something like that on the test to trick you specifically with a jellyfish, but I thought it was worth discussing. That brings us to our first animal phylum. The phylum Porifera is the sponges. The sponges lack tissue, and oftentimes they are asymmetrical, although occasionally they can appear to have radial symmetry. The adults are sessile, so they're attached to the substrate, and the larvae are free swimming. Sponges can actually do sexual or asexual reproduction, and they are filter feeders, so they're suspension feeders. Our next phylum is the cnidarians. Cnidarians have radial symmetry, and they have two different body forms. They can have this sessile or attached to the substrate form here, which is called the polyp, or they can have this motile, meaning it can move on its own form, which is the medusa form. They have stinging cells called cnidocytes that contain nematocysts. Some of them are more sticky than stinging. Jellyfish have, or cnidarians in general, have simple muscles and nerves. Their muscles don't originate from the mesoderm, since they only have two tissue layers, so they're not true muscles. And jellyfish and other cnidarians have a simple nervous system with a nerve net. And their body plan we'll talk more about that in our animal form and function unit, but they have kind of this sac with one opening for the mouth and anus, and that is called the gastrovascular cavity. That gastrovascular cavity functions both in digestion and circulation, hence gastrovascular cavity. So we did asymmetrical organisms, the phylum Porifera sponges, radially symmetrical organisms, the cnidarians, and then the rest of the organisms we're going to talk about are in bilatera grouping. So they are bilaterally symmetrical. So these organisms all have true tissue. They have bilateral symmetry, and this includes three clades: the leucotrophozoans, which we'll talk about the mollusks, annelids, and platyhelminthes. That's not the only organisms in there, but those are the ones we're going to focus on. They're named for lophophore, which is feeding tentacles, and trochophore larvae. Then the echidzozoans, which we'll talk about nematodes and arthropods, they are named for ecdysis, which is the fancy word for molting. And then the deuterostomes, which includes the echinoderms and chordata. So those lophotrochozoans, their members either have a lophophore, which is this kind of sort of crown of ciliated tentacles. That includes the bryozoans, brachiopods, and rotifers. It's not that they're not important, but we have a ton to memorize, so don't memorize those. Or they have this trochophore larval stage, which I've pictured here. So it's this free swimming larval stage. That includes mollusks, annelids, and platyhelminthes. So the platyhelminthes are the flatworms. They're really flat. So these are sort of interesting organisms because since they are so flat, they do not need specialized respiratory or circulatory systems. They can just do gas exchange by simple diffusion. They're often predatory organisms. They had the first triploblast, so they had 3 tissue layers. So the mesoderm, that middle layer, was a key innovation for them. And they are acoelomate, meaning they lack a fluid-filled cavity. This includes the planarian and flukes and tapeworms, and then also there are marine flatworms that are kind of, I don't know, they're brightly colored, so kind of pretty to look at. Our next phylum is the mollusks. Mollusks have a soft body that often has a shell. Broadly speaking, mollusks have something called a foot, a visceral mask where their organs are in their body, and then a mantle. They have a coelom, but it's just confined to a small area around the heart. So here's their heart here, and the coelom is that fluid-filled cavity just right around the heart. They have an open circulatory system. They have specialized structures for excretion called metanephridia. They have this spiky tongue called a radula, and this includes slugs, snails, mollusks, clams, octopus, squid, and nautilus. That brings us to the annelids, which are segmented worms. They're made up of repeating units separated by a septum. They have a circulatory system, and their coelom fluid carry nutrients, waste, and respiratory gases around their body. They have a complete and unsegmented digestive system. They do sexual reproduction with internal fertilization, or in some cases they can do asexual reproduction by breaking apart. This includes earthworms, leeches, and these marine worms that are kind of cool called polychaetes. So then the clade echidzozoans is separated from that lophotrochozoan clade both by what they look like, their morphology, and molecular data. Echidzozoans are named for ecdysis, which is the fancy word for molting. All echidzozoans possess a cuticle for support and protection. Some of them do metamorphosis, right? Like a caterpillar goes through stages and becomes a butterfly. And this includes the nematodes, which are roundworms, and the arthropods. And we'll talk about both of those phyla coming up on their own slide. So the nematodes are the roundworms. They have a collagen-based protein cuticle that covers their body. They have a pseudocoelom that acts as a hydrostatic skeleton and a circulatory system. They have a complete digestive tract, and their reproduction is usually sexual with separate males and females, and they do internal fertilization. There are a large number of parasitic roundworms, for example, hookworm and pinworm, and the roundworm that causes elephantiasis. So elephantiasis is elephant-like swelling. It's a roundworm that gets in the lymphatic tissue and doesn't allow extracellular fluid to be returned to the blood, so it causes this huge swelling here. So let's review. Number 7, which of these are worms? Select all that apply. So A is Platyhelminthes, that's a flatworm, so that's a worm. B, Cnidarian, that's a jellyfish, not a worm. C, Nematode, that's a roundworm, it's a worm. Mollusk, that's like a squid, octopus, snail, slug, not a worm. Porifera, that's a sponge, not a worm. Annelid, that's a segmented worm, that's a worm. Which of these are segmented? Platyhelminthes, that's a flatworm, not segmented. Nematode, roundworm, not segmented. Porifera, sponge, not segmented. Annelid, segmented worm, it is segmented. So 8 is D. Number 9, which of these lacks true tissues? Cnidaria jellyfish has true tissue. Mollusk is slug, snail, squid, etc. That has true tissues, but the sponge does not have true tissues. And then number 10, ecdysis is the fancy word for molting. So that brings us to the phylum Arthropoda. 3/4 of all described living animal species are arthropods. They have an exoskeleton made of chitin, like the fungal cell wall, and protein. They have jointed appendages. They are segmented. They're cephalized, right? Meaning, so they have a head with specialized sensory organs for sight, touch, smell, hearing, and balance. They have compound eyes and a sophisticated brain. They have an open circulatory system and complex organs for gas exchange, digestion, and excretory systems, which we'll talk more about when we get to our animal form and function unit. And there are several different groups, including trilobites, which are extinct, spiders, scorpions, ticks, millipedes, centipedes, insects, and crustaceans. As far as what I've pictured here for you, this first one's a millipede. It has 2 pairs of leg for body segment, and this guy here is a centipede. This is a spider, crab. This one's a little tricky, but these are barnacles on the thing in the background is a whale. Insect, arachnid, and then the roly-poly is actually a terrestrial crustacean. So that brings us to the deuterostomes. Remember that blastopore becomes the anus in the deuterostomes. So that includes the phylum Echinodermata and the phylum Chordata. In Echinodermata, that's things like starfish and sea cucumbers. Echinodermata, their larvae are bilaterally symmetrical, but their adults have kind of a modified radial symmetry. Cephalization is absent, so they do not have a head, they don't have a brain, they have a simple nervous system, they have a water vascular system, and they don't have specialized excretory organs. Instead, they do respiration and excretion by diffusion. Some of them can detach body parts, and those body parts will regenerate, and they do sexual reproduction. Then we've got the phylum Chordata, which is the phylum that we are in. And kind of the key distinguishing innovations for this are that they have a notochord, which is a supporting rod. They have a dorsal hollow nerve cord, so dorsal is backside, so they have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. They have pharyngeal slits or clefts and a postanal tail. And the Chordata phylum has both invertebrate and vertebrate members. So nobody up until this point in our lecture has had a backbone, but now we're getting into some organisms that have a backbone. So again, in deuterostomia, we have the phylum Echinodermata. It's named for having spiny skin, Echinodermata. This includes sea stars, brittle stars, sea urchins, feather stars, and sea cucumbers, which I've pictured here on this slide for you. So then with the chordates, there are some chordates that are in vertebrates. There's the subphylum Cephalochordata and the subphylum Urochordata. Don't worry about that subphylum name, but know the lancelets and tunicates are both invertebrate chordates. The Lancelets are marine filter feeders, and they're named because they kind of look like a lance, right? Like a sword. And they can do gas exchange across their body surfaces. They're usually sessile, so attached into that substrate, but can burrow and swim. The tunicates are named for kind of looking like a tunic, right? So they're these animals that are encased in a tunic. The adult is sessile with only pharyngeal slits, but their larval form has all of the chordate characteristics like that postanal tail, the notochord, dorsal hollow nerve cord, and those pharyngeal slits. So then some chordates do have a backbone. Vertebrates are chordates with a backbone. The vertebral column replaces the notochord. The cranium is the bony housing that encases the anterior end of the nerve cord, so that encases the brain. They have an endoskeleton of cartilage or bone. They have a neural crest, which is embryonic cells that are found on either side of the neural tube, and those cells migrate and form many other cell types like neurons or skeletal tissue or connective tissue. And then vertebrates also have more diversity of their internal organs. So, for example, like we have a liver and a kidney and various glands and a multi-chambered heart. So the simplest vertebrates would be cyclostomes. Stome, in this case, is opening, and cyclo, circular. So they have kind of this circular mouth. They are jawless vertebrates. This includes the hagfish, which are these blind, slimy fish. They have a really keen sense of smell. And also the lamprey, again, jawless fish, but it sure has plenty of teeth, right? They're just not set in a jaw. And there are marine and freshwater lamprey. And then this probably goes without saying if you look at the picture, but they are often parasitic. So let's review number 11, true or false. All chordates have a backbone. That is false. The tunicates and lancelets are invertebrate chordates. True or false, all chordates have a hinged jaw. That's also false. Those cyclostomes and the tunicates and the lancelets all do not have a hinged jaw. But speaking of hinged jaw, that brings us to the gnathostomes, which are the jawed vertebrates. So the hinged jaw developed from pharyngeal arches and evolutionarily modified this existing feature to form the jaw. Some gill arches were lost, some were modified, but this gets us to the jawed vertebrates. Our first class of jawed vertebrates is the chondrichthyes. Chondro means cartilage. Ichthyes means fish, so these are the cartilaginous fish. They've got a skeleton of flexible cartilage, and really more evidence is indicating that this cartilaginous skeleton was a derived characteristic, meaning they evolved from organisms with a bony skeleton, but developmental changes prevented the cartilage from kind of ossifying or hardening into bone. They have a dual-chambered heart with single circulation, which we'll talk more about that in our animal form and function unit. They have a lateral line system for pressure wave detection. They have a very powerful sense of smell and internal fertilization. So again, chondrichthyes, cartilaginous fish, sharks, skates, rays, chimeras. That brings us to the osteichthyans. Oste, bone, ichthy, fish. These are the bony fish. They have an operculum to cover their gills. They have a swim bladder for buoyancy, and this includes the ray-finned fish, which is the actinopterygii, and the lobe-finned fish, which includes subclasses Tenistia and Dipone. But big takeaway here, ray-finned fish, lobe-finned fish. When you're imagining fish, probably your typical fish that you're imagining is this ray-finned fish, where they have these fins with thin, bony, flexible rays. These lobe-finned fish have thicker, more muscular fins here. Like, look at this lungfish down here. Like, that is a thicker fin for sure. That brings us to tetrapods. That root word tetra means four, pod means foot. So these are gnathostomes, so jawed organisms with 4 limbs. It doesn't technically have to be 4 actual feet, but 4 limbs. So the transition to land involved adaptations for locomotion and reproduction and to prevent desiccation, which is that fancy word for drying out. And sturdy lobe-finned fishes are the ancestors to animals with 4 limbs. That vertebral column, so their backbone had to strengthen, and the hip and shoulder bones braced against the backbone. These changes are likely due to changes in gene expression, in particular the Hox genes. So this includes amphibia, reptilia, and mammalia. So the amphibians, amphi means both. So that's talking about their life cycle where they live on land but require water to reproduce. They have an aquatic larval stage and external fertilization. So females are going to lay their eggs in water where they will be fertilized by sperm that's also released into water. They do something called buccal pumping where they open their mouth and that draws air into their mouth, and then they close their mouth and that forces air into their lungs. Their skin is also able to absorb oxygen. They have a 3-chambered heart. They do metamorphosis, which is regulated by the thyroid, and this includes things like frogs, toads, and salamanders. So let's review. Let's match the animal to the correct class. Our first one here, this is a ray-finned fish, so it is B. Actinopterygii. Down here we have a cartilaginous fish, so that's Chondrichthyes, and lastly here we've got a little salamander, which is an amphibian. That brings us to the amniotes, which are tetrapods with an amniotic egg. The amniotic egg is super important because it broke the tie to water. So organisms with an amniotic egg don't have to lay their eggs in water. The egg itself protects the embryo from drying out. The amniotic egg includes the amnion, which is the fluid that protects the embryo, the allantosis, which does gas exchange and removal of waste, the yolk sac for food, the chorion, which surrounds the other membranes, the albumin, which is kind of like that white of the egg, and they often have a shell. But this is a little bit tricky because placental animals or placental mammals are also amniote, but that placenta is just a highly modified shell. Other important innovations of amniotes, they have skin that resists drying out, so desiccation-resistant skin. They do thoracic breathing, so we breathe by increasing the size of our thoracic cavity, and then that draws air in rather than having to open our mouth and then push the air in like the amphibians did. We have specialized organs like kidneys for conserving water. We do internal fertilization, and this includes reptiles, which now includes birds, and mammals. So reptiles includes, our book calls them turtles, but technically turtles are aquatic, tortoises are terrestrial, and terrapins live in fresh or brackish water. So testudines is probably more appropriate, but I'm not going to get super hung up on that on the test. These animals have a hard protective shell which is fused to their bones, like their ribs are actually fused to the shell, and they do not have teeth, but they do have a sharp beak. This also includes the squamates, which are the lizards and snakes. With lizards and snakes, they have a very mobile skull with extremely mobile joints, and they have overlapping scales. And I'm not going to ask you to differentiate between, lizards and snakes with their eyelids and external ear structures. But lizards have movable eyelids and external ears, and snakes do not. So then the crocodilians are reptiles as well. This includes crocodiles and alligators. They have a 4-chambered heart and teeth in sockets, and they do parental care. There's also the birds and the reptiles. They have a warm body temperature. They have double circulation with a 4-chambered heart. And then birds have some unique characteristics that allow them to fly. They have feathers, which evolutionarily they're modified scales. They also have air sacs for very efficient breathing. They often have reduction of organs, like they have a single ovary, and they don't have a urinary bladder. And they have a lightweight skeleton. Oftentimes it's kind of described as hollow, but it's not hollow like a straw. It's more of this like honeycomb structure here. So they have more lightweight skeletons. So that brings us to the mammals, which are the milk-producing amniotes. They appeared about 225 million years ago, and after the dinosaurs went extinct, mammals really flourished, and they had adaptive radiation where there's just this huge range of sizes and body forms in mammals. They have mammary glands that secrete milk. Mammals, particularly terrestrial mammals, have hair. They have specialized teeth and they have an enlarged skull. So there's an enlarged brain that fits in that enlarged skull. We have a single lower jaw bone and 3 inner ear bones and external ears. I put a bat here on the slide. Students sometimes don't think of bats when they think of mammals, so there's a bat as a mammal example for you. There are some kind of unique mammals. The monotremes are the egg-laying mammals. So the platypus and the echidna are examples of monotremes. They lay eggs, they don't have a placenta, and they have poorly developed nipples. Then there's marsupials. They were once really widespread, but now they're mostly found in Australia. So typically, I think when people think of marsupials, they think of a kangaroo or a wallaby, but the North American marsupial example is the possum. The young are born very underdeveloped and they have to make it to the marsupium, which is the fancy word for the pouch, to finish their development. Then we've got the eutherians, which are the placental mammals. They develop in a relatively long-lived and complex placenta, and there's a relatively prolonged gestation. So let's review. Match the animals to their location on the phylogenetic tree. I would encourage you to pause so you can think this through before you just listen to me answer this for you. But go ahead and take a pause and see if you can work out which group goes on which part of this phylogenetic tree. So there's really kind of 2 ways we could do this. We could either start at like the simplest groups or the more complex groups. Let's go ahead and start at our simplest group over here. So this grouping has a vertebral column, a cranium, and endoskeleton, but does not have jaws. So that's going to be our cyclostomes, the circle openings. So number 7 goes on our first one. And then our next branch here has jaws, but it doesn't have a bony skeleton. So that's going to be our cartilaginous fish, our chondrichthyes. So that's going to be 3. And then this has got bony skeletons. Lungs or lung derivatives, but not lobe fins yet. So our ray-finned fishes are those actinopterygii. So this one is 6. Then our lobed fin fishes are these 2. So that's going to be 2 there. And then having those limbs, but not amniotic eggs, milk, or hair, that's going to be our amphibians. And then having an amniotic egg but not milk or hair will be the reptiles. And then having all of these characteristics, that's going to be the mammals. So this tree shows you the different vertebrates. So everyone in this one is in the vertebrate clade. That means they have a backbone, so they have a vertebral column. And then we had Myxini and Pteromyzontidia, which are cyclostomes. So those are the jawless fishes. Everything else from here on technically is a gnathostome, so they have jaws. Then we have chondrichthyes. That root word chondro means cartilage. Ichthyes means fish. So these are our cartilaginous fishes. Everybody else on our tree is osteichthyans, which means bony fish. So there's the actinopterygii, which are those ray-finned fishes. Those are probably what you would think of like a typical fish. So like a goldfish or bass is in actinopterygii. Then we have the lobed-finned fishes. They have those sturdy, kind of more muscular lobe fins. And then we have tetrapods who evolved from a lobed-finned fish ancestor. And tetrapods are going to have, tetra is 4, pod is feet. So they have 4 limbs, and those limbs have digits on them. So that would include amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. So this tree has all of the different animal phyla on it. So the groups we are going to need to have memorized. We have porifera, which is the sponges. Don't worry about the ctenophores, but you will need to know cnidaria, which is jellyfish. Don't worry about hemichordata, but we will need to know echinodermata. They're named for their spiny skin, so echinospiny dermata skin. Chordata, we're in that group. So there are things with a notochord. The vertebrates fall into chordata. Platyhelminthes, you'll need to know. They're the flatworms. Don't worry about rotifers. Don't worry about ectoprocta. Don't worry about brachiopoda. Do know the mollusks. So that would be squid, octopi, snails, slugs, things like that. Annelids are segmented worms. Nematodes are roundworms. Arthropods have exoskeletons made of chitin and jointed appendages. So insects, ticks, spiders, scorpions, lobsters, lots of different things with exoskeletons and jointed appendages. If we look at our other words here, deuterostomes, that means that blastopore, that first opening, develops into the anus. Bilatera, that means these organisms have left and right halves. And then we have the lophotrochozoans and echidzozoans. Those are both invertebrate clades. Echidzozoans named for echidiosis, which is molting, and the lophotrochozoans named for the distinctive larval structures. So we made it to the end of chapter 27. So we talked about those chanoflagellate protists, which are the closest relatives to animals. We talked about porifera, which are the sponges, cnidaria, the jellyfish, bilateral, so organisms with left and right halves, the different kinds of symmetry, so asymmetry, where there's really not symmetry, and radial symmetry, where the organism is like a circle, and you can cut them in half along kind of the middle anyway, like along the radius or diameter. We talked about a coelom, so that body cavity that's completely lined with mesoderm. We talked about the different invertebrate bilaterans, which we just talked about our previous slide too. So annelids are segmented worms, nematodes are roundworms, arthropods, exoskeleton jointed appendages, deuterostomes, that blastopore developed into the anus, and that includes the echinodermata, and then chordates. So echinodermata are starfish and they're invertebrate. Chordates are not all vertebrates. There are invertebrate chordates, but vertebrates are included in chordates. Cyclostomes and gnathostomes. Cyclostomes are those jawless fish. Gnathostomes have jaws. Chondrichthyes are cartilaginous fishes. Osteichthyans, bony fishes. Actinopterygii, ray-finned fish. The Echinista and Diponi, those are lobed fin fishes. Arthropods, oh, we already did arthropods. We just talked about them a second ago, but arthropods, jointed appendages, exoskeleton. Tetrapods have 4 limbs with digits. Amphibians, part of their life, that would be like a frog. An amphibian, part of their life cycle is on land, part of it is in water. Amniotes are vertebrates with an amniotic egg. That would include reptiles and mammals. So reptiles include squamates, which is lizards and snakes, turtles, crocodilians, and birds. And then mammals, we've got monotremes, which are egg-laying mammals. Marsupials have really underdeveloped young that have to make it to the marsupium to develop further, so they have a pouch. So like a kangaroo is a marsupial. And then eutherians, those are placental mammals, like we're placental mammals, or a dog is a placental mammal, or an elephant's a placental mammal. And then that's pretty much it for chapter 27.